God damn it, what the hell do you think you're doing? Filthy. Disgusting. That's something you don't touch. You serve it, you watch it, but you don't ever hold it. Nathaniel Blake's voice cut like broken glass. He stormed into the room, yanked the baby girl from Maya Williams' arms with a force that made her breath catch. No, please! She just fell asleep. She wouldn't stop crying. I don't care. He barked. You're the maid, not the mother, not anything. Up, the baby screamed the moment she left Maya's chest. It was like something snapped. Her tiny hands clawed at the air, her sobs shrill and panicked. Shh, Lily, shh. It's okay, sweetheart, I'm here, Nathaniel whispered. But the child only cried harder, writhing in his arms, red-faced and gasping. Her goal this morning was simple. Keep the day steady for Aria, Graham's 5-year-old daughter. That meant avoiding Victor if possible, smoothing any tension before it reached the child, and keeping her own presence quiet but steady. Selina had learned that power didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispered in the spaces between other people's noise. It was mid-morning in Manhattan, the kind of brittle winter day where the light poured in hard through the glass and made even the shadows look sharp. Outside the penthouse's east-facing windows, the East River glimmered under a layer of pale sky. Inside, the air carried a faint aroma of fresh coffee from the breakfast service that had just been cleared. The doorman's voice had floated up over the intercom earlier, announcing Victor's arrival. Selina had tucked that away as a note to move carefully. Selina moved through the dining room with a steady pace, the worn leather of her flats soft against the parquet floor. Aria sat at the end of the long table, coloring a page with determined strokes of crayon. Graham was in his study on a call, his voice low and firm behind the closed door. Victor, she guessed, was in the adjoining lounge. She could hear the soft creak of a leather chair and the sound of ice settling in a glass. Victor Alden had a way of making any room feel smaller. In his late 40s, with silver threading his dark hair and a suit cut to project easy authority, he carried himself like a man certain the rules bent for him. When Selina stepped into the lounge to clear a tray, he looked up with a half-smile. You've been here? What, a month? His voice was conversational, but edged with something sharper. 6 weeks, she said evenly, stacking the cups, and already running the place. He swirled the ice in his glass. Must be nice to have Graham's trust. That doesn't come easy. Selina didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that silence could be stronger than the wrong words. She turned toward the kitchen, feeling his gaze follow her. Later that morning, she took Aria down to the building's private garden level. The girl loved feeding the sparrows that darted in and out between the bare hedges. Selina kept her coat collar turned up against the wind, scanning the courtyard. She caught sight of Victor on the far side, speaking to a man in a dark overcoat she didn't recognize. Their conversation was low, urgent. When Victor noticed her, his expression didn't change, but the man in the coat turned and left quickly through the side gate. By lunchtime, Graham emerged from his study, loosening his tie. Victor's staying for the board dinner tonight, he said. I'll need you to keep Aria with you until after. His eyes lingered a moment, as though there was more he wanted to say, but didn't. The afternoon stretched quietly until just before sunset. Selina was in the kitchen rinsing apples for Aria's snack when she noticed the absence. The playroom on the security monitor was empty. Her pulse sharpened. She crossed the hall in quick steps, the soles of her shoes soft against the carpet, calling for Aria. No answer. The elevator was at the rooftop level. Selina's chest tightened. She swiped her staff pass and rode up, the hum of the lift too slow for her urgency. When the doors opened, the winter air bit at her face. Aria stood near the glass railing, her small, mittened hands gripping the top. Victor was beside her, leaning casually on the rail as though this were a planned outing. Fresh air's good for kids, he said without looking at Selina. This isn't the nursery, Selina replied, stepping forward. Her voice stayed calm, but her body was already angled between Arya and the railing. Let's go inside. Victor turned his head, studying her with a faint amusement. You're quick to assume there's danger where there isn't. Graham's voice cut through the wind from behind her. What exactly are you doing up here, Victor? His tone was sharp, stripped of the corporate smoothness he usually carried. Victor straightened. Just giving the girl a view. No harm done. Graham stepped forward, taking Arya's hand. Get her back to the suite, he said to Selina, his eyes never leaving Victor. Inside the elevator, Arya leaned against Selina's coat. He said Daddy would be busy for a long time, the child murmured. Selina's jaw tightened. In the hallway outside the nursery, Janine Rhodes, one of the junior analysts, was walking past with a file folder. She hesitated, glanced at Arya, then at Selina. Her voice dropped. This isn't the first time something's been off. You might want to watch for patterns. And then she kept walking. Selina returned to the kitchen, the warmth of the room almost jarring after the cold rooftop. She could hear Graham's voice faintly from down the hall, low, controlled, but with a steel edge she hadn't heard before. She didn't see Victor again that night. But the silence in the apartment had returned, heavier now, carrying the weight of something unspoken. She didn't see Janine again until the night everything came crashing down. By the time the first snow began to fall the next morning, Selina Carter was already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, and the city still half asleep beyond the glass. The smell of toast drifted from the oven, and the steam rose from her mug in slow spirals, but her mind was not on breakfast. She kept thinking about Janine Rhodes' passing remark the night before, watch for patterns. It was the kind of warning you couldn't just brush away. She remembered Margaret's earlier caution about Victor Alden and felt a thread pulled tight between the two conversations. Two people from very different corners of Graham Ellsworth's world had hinted at something in the shadows, and it wasn't coincidence. Selina knew from her own life that people rarely spoke such warnings unless they were certain of what they'd seen. Today's goal was to keep her own presence subtle while quietly learning what she could. She had no illusions about how dangerous it could be to openly challenge someone like Victor. His kind of power came with invisible weapons, influence, money, the kind of connections that erased consequences. But quiet information gathering, the way her father once taught her to listen before speaking, could shift the ground before the real confrontation came. It was late morning when the Ellsworth penthouse began to stir with preparations for that evening's board dinner. The catering team came first, their rolling carts of silver trays and white linen cutting across the parquet floors. Then Graham's assistant arrived with a leather-bound folder and the faint air of someone carrying news that wasn't entirely welcome. Selina kept to the periphery, carrying Arya's book bag into the study, her ears tuned to the voices she passed. She found Graham at his desk, scanning the contents of the folder while his assistant stood stiffly by. "So the vote's sooner than expected?" Graham asked, without looking up. "Yes, sir. Victor's been meeting with several of the other directors privately. We believe he's positioning for something ahead of schedule." Selina kept her expression neutral as she set the bag down, but her pulse ticked up. She knew better than to linger. Too much attention could turn her from invisible to noticed, and that wasn't the move to make today. In the early afternoon, she took Arya down to the lobby for her weekly piano lesson in the building's music room. As they passed the concierge desk, Selina caught sight of Victor by the revolving doors, shaking hands with the same man in the dark overcoat from the garden. Their conversation was brief, but the way Victor's eyes flicked to her as she passed told her he knew she was observing, even if only in passing. When they returned upstairs an hour later, the living room had been rearranged to accommodate an additional table for the evening. Margaret was polishing silver. She looked up, caught Selina's eye, and gave the faintest shake of her head toward the hallway. Selina understood it meant stay out of earshot, but it was impossible to avoid everything. While fetching extra glassware from the pantry, Selina overheard Victor in the adjoining lounge speaking to another man, his voice low but clear enough to catch certain words. Leverage, compliance, move quickly. She stayed still, pretending to sort through glasses until the conversation ended with the soft scrape of a chair. The hours slid forward toward evening. Guests began to arrive, the low hum of voices filling the apartment, mingling with the muted notes of a string quartet hired for the night. Selina ushered Aria into the media room with a new animated film, ensuring the child was content before moving toward the service area to assist the catering staff. Midway through the dinner, Graham excused himself from the table and crossed into the hallway, his expression taut. Selina happened to be there, collecting a tray. "Has Victor been near Aria today?" he asked quietly. "Only in the lobby earlier," she replied. "Nothing more." Graham gave a short nod, as if measuring her answer against something he already suspected. "Keep it that way." He returned to the dining room before she could ask more. The night's turning point came just after dessert was served. Selina was in the kitchen when Janine appeared in the doorway, her usual guarded demeanor replaced by a flicker of urgency. "You didn't hear it from me," she began, "but Victor's been using Graham's name to authorize certain transactions, ones he'd never approve if he knew, and now with this board vote coming up..." She let the rest hang in the air. Selina absorbed the words without letting her surprise show. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Janine glanced toward the dining room. "Because Graham listens to you in a way he doesn't with most, and because if Victor wins whatever he's planning, people like me won't last here." Before Selina could respond, the sound of raised voices carried down the hall. Graham and Victor, their words overlapping sharp, clipped, the kind of exchange that left no room for pleasantries. Then the sudden scrape of a chair against hardwood. Selina stepped into the corridor in time to see Victor exiting the dining room, his expression smoothed into something that wasn't quite a smile. He passed her without a word, but the cold satisfaction in his eyes said enough. The moment the door closed behind him, Graham's voice called from the dining room, steady but edged with something she hadn't heard before. "Selina, could you come here a moment?" The first thing Selina noticed as she stepped into the dining room was how quickly the atmosphere had shifted. Only moments ago, the air had been filled with the polite clink of forks and the muted conversation of board members. Now, the room felt brittle, as though the tension between Graham and Victor had left a residue in every corner. Graham stood at the head of the table, his hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, watching her with the faintest crease between his brows. She recalled the earlier warning from Janine, the one about Victor authorizing transactions under Graham's name. It rang louder in her mind now, like a drumbeat beneath her ribs. The memory of Margaret's silent shake of the head earlier in the day layered on top of it, turning her unease into something sharper. Graham wouldn't have called her into this room in front of so many, unless there was a reason, a calculated reason. The purpose of this moment was clear. Graham wanted to draw her into the conversation without giving Victor any more space to maneuver. That meant whatever was about to happen would push the simmering undercurrent of the day closer to a boil. She stepped forward, aware of every eye on her. The room itself was a study, in contrasts the flicker of candlelight across crystal glasses, the rich scent of coffee being poured by a server in the corner, the snow-muted city stretching beyond the wall of glass. Yet under the polish was a pulse of unease. the kind that no expensive table setting could disguise. At the table were the usual players. Graham's longtime ally, Daniel Price, leaning back with his arms crossed. Two directors Selina didn't know well, watching her with guarded interest. And at the far end, Margaret, seated in her usual quiet grace, though her eyes were unusually alert. Graham gestured for Selina to stand near him, a placement that didn't go unnoticed. "I was just telling our guests," Graham began, "that there are some who take liberties with another man's name, believing it grants them authority. Selina, in your time here, have you seen or heard anything that suggests people have been making decisions on my behalf without my consent?" The question was a blade dressed as silk. Selina took a slow breath. "I have overheard conversations that made me question whether every action was approved," she said carefully. "But I've also learned that in this home, not every truth is spoken aloud." A faint murmur passed down the table. Graham's gaze stayed on her, but she could feel the room shifting, certain minds calculating how much weight to give her words. Victor was not present, but his absence felt like a presence all its own. A shadow draped over the table. The rest of the evening unfolded in long, deliberate beats. Between courses, Graham asked about each member's perspective on transparency and board ethics, framing his questions with just enough edge to make it clear that he wasn't speaking in the abstract. Selina remained at his side, passing coffee cups, clearing plates, but also absorbing the dynamics who spoke confidently, who avoided eye contact, who kept glancing toward the door as if expecting Victor to return. When the dinner finally wound down, Graham excused himself, and Selina walked the last guests to the elevator. As the doors closed, Daniel Price lingered in the hall. "You've got a better sense of this place than most of us," he said quietly. "If you've got reason to think Victor's making moves, you should know the vote isn't the only thing at stake. Sometimes the smaller levers are the ones that change the whole machine." Later that night, with Arya asleep and the apartment finally still, Selina moved through the dimly lit kitchen to pour herself water. Margaret was there, polishing the last of the silver. "You handled yourself well tonight," she said without looking up. "I only told the truth as I know it," Selina replied. Margaret set down the cloth, meeting her gaze. "Then be ready to tell more, because Victor isn't going to leave you out of this now. He's going to come closer." The words hung between them like a prophecy. Selina thought of the way Victor's eyes had met hers in the lobby earlier, and of the faint satisfaction in his expression when he left the dining room. A sound from the hallway broke the moment the faint click of the service door, the one that led to the staff entrance. Selina turned toward it, but no one was there. Just a draft of cold air seeping in from the stairwell. She stepped forward, closed the door, and locked it. The next morning, long before sunrise, she would find an unmarked envelope slipped under her bedroom door. Selina found the envelope before she even reached for the light switch. Its stark white surface lay against the dark grain of her floor. No handwriting, no markings, just the faint crease from where it had been sealed. She bent to pick it up, her mind immediately returning to Margaret's warning the night before. The paper was cool, as though it had only just been slipped under her door. She remembered Daniel Price's quiet advice after the dinner that the smaller levers could move the whole machine. Whatever was inside this envelope felt like one of those levers. She hesitated only a moment before sliding a finger under the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, bearing a list of dates, transaction codes, and the same initials repeated in the margin. VC, the most recent date was just 3 days ago. Her goal now was clear. She needed to confirm whether these transactions were what she suspected, and if so, understand how deep Victor's influence had spread. The idea of confronting him without proof was pointless. The man thrived on turning accusation into insult. The kitchen clock read 5:15 a.m. when Selina slipped into her coat and made her way out of the apartment. Outside, the city was in its quietest hour, the streets washed in amber streetlight, the air holding the bite of a late winter morning. She walked to the corner coffee shop, one of the few open, its neon sign buzzing faintly above the frosted windows. Inside, she found a booth at the back and pulled out her phone. She dialed a number she had memorized months ago, but had never used an accountant Graham trusted, a man named Leonard Kessler. He answered on the third ring, voice still gravelly with sleep. "Selina, is something wrong?" "I need to meet," she said. "This morning, if possible. It's about transactions tied to Victor. I think they're unauthorized." An hour later, Leonard sat across from her, his overcoat draped over the bench, a steaming cup of black coffee between his hands. She slid the paper across to him. He read it without comment, then reached for a pen from his pocket and began jotting notes in the margin. "These aren't just unauthorized," he said finally. "They're designed to bypass standard reporting. Whoever did this knows the system well too well." Selina felt the floor under this world shift again. "Can you trace them back?" "Yes," Leonard replied. "But it means pulling records that will get noticed. If Victor has someone watching, they'll know someone's digging. Or..." She nodded slowly. "Then we do it quietly. No paper trail back to me." Later that morning, Selina returned to the building through the service entrance, moving past staff who barely looked up from their tasks. When she entered the main lobby, she spotted Victor near the elevators, speaking in low tones to a man she didn't recognize. His gaze found her before the elevator doors closed. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his mouth, as though they shared a secret. The rest of the day passed in small bursts of activity, helping Margaret prepare for a luncheon, reviewing guest lists, fielding calls from suppliers. But under it all ran the steady hum of tension, every interaction touched by the knowledge that something larger was building. By mid-afternoon, Graham called her into his study. The heavy drapes muted the winter light, and the faint scent of cedar lingered in the air. He gestured for her to sit. "I've been getting reports about decisions being made without my consent," he said. "I know you've been hearing and seeing more than you say." Selina measured her words. "I've seen enough to know it's not isolated. There's a pattern, and it points back to Victor." Graham's expression darkened. "Then it's time we prepare for a vote. If I can't trust him, I can't keep him close." That night, just before she turned in, a text arrived from Leonard. The message contained only 6 words. "Found something you'll want to see." Selina stared at the screen, heart hammering, already knowing this was the kind of discovery that would change everything. Leonard's office smelled faintly of old paper and the oil from the leather chairs, the kind of scent that came from decades of guarded conversations. Selina stood by the window, watching the muted gray of the city morning while Leonard spread files across his desk. He had insisted they meet in person, too much risk, he'd said, in passing this kind of information over a phone line or email. He began sliding documents toward her, each one a fragment of the same picture. "These are purchase orders routed through shell suppliers," he said quietly. "Every one of them overvalued by 30 to 40%, with the surplus going to an account in the Caymans under the name Valcrest Holdings. Guess who signed off on every transfer?" Selina didn't need to guess. "Victor." Leonard nodded, tapping one page. "And here's the twist, Valcrest isn't just a shell. It's a holding entity that owns stakes in 3 competing firms. Victor's been using company funds to strengthen rival positions while weakening Graham's." Her chest tightened. This wasn't just about greed. It was sabotage, calculated to leave Graham without the leverage to recover. She thought back to Margaret's unease at recent board discussions, the way Victor had been steering conversations toward strategic downsizing and asset reallocation. He'd been preparing the ground for months, maybe years. "I can get you a full report," Leonard said. "But the moment this moves beyond my desk, it becomes a fight. You'll need someone on the inside to keep the doors open when they try to shut you out." She thought of Margaret, of the subtle signals she'd given, the careful warnings. "I might already have someone," Selina said. By midday, Selina was walking through the marble lobby of Graham's building with a slim portfolio under her arm. She had called Margaret from the taxi and asked for 5 minutes alone. The older woman ushered her into a side office without question, locking the door behind them. Selina laid the documents out across the desk. Margaret's eyes moved quickly over each page, her lips pressing tighter with every line. "I knew he was cutting corners," Margaret murmured, "but this is deliberate treachery." They both knew the next step Graham needed to see it himself, but he had to be prepared for Victor's reaction. Margaret offered to arrange a meeting under the pretense of reviewing the quarterly forecast. "If he's blindsided, Victor might lose control. That could work in our favor." That afternoon, the meeting took place in Graham's private conference room. Selina sat quietly at the far end of the table, while Margaret walked Graham through the legitimate reports. Then, with a measured calm, she slid Selina's documents in front of him. Graham read in silence, the only sound the faint rustle of paper. When he finished, he looked up, his voice flat. "Is Victor in the building?" Margaret nodded. "Send for him," Graham said. The moment Victor entered, the air in the room thickened. He glanced at Selina, then at the papers before Graham. "What is this?" he demanded. "It's your work," Graham said evenly, "and I want to hear you explain it." Victor's smile was quick, almost mocking. "Creative strategy. Necessary in a market this competitive. You taught me that yourself." "This isn't strategy," Graham replied, his voice low but hard. "It's theft and betrayal." Victor's gaze flicked again to Selina, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, as though realizing, perhaps too late, that she had been the thread tying it all together. Before Graham could speak again, Victor leaned forward, his tone turning sharp. "You're making a mistake siding with her." Selina didn't move, didn't speak, just met his stare without blinking. Graham's hand came down on the table, ending the moment. "We'll see who's making the mistake when the board votes tomorrow." Victor straightened, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carried a promise that this was far from over. Rain slicked the streets outside as Selina stepped from the curb into the glow of the street lamp, the folder of evidence tucked securely beneath her coat. She could still hear Victor's last words in the conference room, the warning buried inside them. Margaret had told her afterward that this was exactly how men like him operated, not with open threats, but with quiet moves meant to corner you when the lights were off. Tonight, she was headed to meet Harold Jennings, the retired corporate attorney Graham trusted more than anyone. The diner where they agreed to meet was nearly empty, the clink of cutlery and the low hum of a late-night jazz station creating a strange calm. Selina slid into the booth opposite Harold and placed the folder between them. He opened it without ceremony, his sharp eyes scanning each page. "These contracts are airtight in appearance," he said, "but the layering of shell companies is too deliberate. This wasn't sloppiness, it was architecture. Victor designed it so only someone with full access to internal systems could spot the pattern." Selina leaned in. "If we present this tomorrow, will it hold?" "It will," Harold said, "but you'll need corroboration from someone inside Victor's chain. Without it, he'll claim creative discretion and use the board's appetite for aggressive strategy as his shield." The name that came to her mind immediately was Thomas Avery Victor's own operations manager. He had always been polite, never engaging in the smirking cruelty the others seemed to enjoy. Selina had once caught him hesitating before signing off on one of Victor's inflated invoices. That hesitation could be the crack they needed. The next morning she found Thomas in the loading bay, clipboard in hand, watching as a shipment was unloaded. She walked up without preamble. "Thomas, I know what Victor's been doing, and I think you do too." His jaw tightened, eyes darting towards the security camera overhead. "This isn't the place," he muttered. They ended up in a maintenance corridor, the hum of the building's machinery filling the silence. Selina handed him a copy of one invoice, showing him the inflated numbers and the supplier's Cayman account link. "I have 20 more like this. If you testify, Harold can protect you." Thomas stared at the page for a long moment. He said it was all above board, that Graham approved it. "And did he?" Selina asked. Thomas shook his head. "No, Graham never even saw half of these." That was the break she needed. They agreed to meet Harold after hours, away from the office, to draft a sworn statement. By evening, the three of them sat in Harold's study, the rain still falling steadily outside. Thomas read aloud from his own testimony, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was saying. Harold notarized it on the spot, sealing it inside a plain envelope. "This," Harold said, tapping the envelope, "will put Victor in a corner he can't talk his way out of. But you have to be ready, he'll come at you with everything before he falls." Selina left with the envelope in her bag, aware that every step she took from here on would be watched. As she walked to her car, headlights flared in the rain, a black sedan pulling slowly into the far end of the lot. The driver's silhouette didn't move. She unlocked her door, slid inside, and started the engine. In her rearview mirror, the sedan's lights came on, easing forward as she pulled out onto the slick road. The distance between them closed, and she realized this wasn't chance. Someone wanted her to know she wasn't alone out here. From the very first moment Selina stepped into that corporate lobby, the imbalance was clear. The looks that lingered too long, the subtle hesitations, the condescending tone that carried the weight of an unspoken assumption, they all spoke of a system designed to remind her where they thought she belonged. It was not an accident, nor the product of one man's bad day. It was a structure, a culture, a quiet agreement among those in power that prejudice could be disguised as policy, and bias could be hidden behind the sterile language of procedure. Selina had a choice in those moments. She could have walked away, swallowed the insult, told herself that nothing could be done without losing everything she had worked for. But that was never who she was. Quiet strength is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear make your choices for you. She knew that in order to change what she was facing, she had to confront not just a man, but the machinery that protected him. The early days of her fight were lonely. The allies were silent at first, some afraid, others unsure. She endured rooms where her words were ignored until repeated by someone else. She endured decisions made without her input, despite her role. And she endured the calculated little slights that, over time, can break a person's sense of self if they are not careful. But Selina was careful. She remembered every detail, every name, every time the policy was used as a shield for cruelty. She was not gathering grudges, she was gathering proof. The courage she displayed was not the kind that shouts across a crowded room. It was the kind that sits quietly in the corner, listening, waiting, building an unshakable foundation for the day when the truth would matter more than the comfort of keeping silent. Her patience paid off when she found allies with the same quiet fire. Harold Jennings brought experience, the wisdom of someone who had seen too much and knew the importance of striking when the moment was right. Thomas Avery brought conscience, the kind that wakes you up in the middle of the night and forces you to decide who you really are. They each had a choice: to remain comfortable in the safety of neutrality, or to risk something for the sake of justice. When the confrontation came, it was not with a single dramatic outburst, but with a steady unveiling of truth that left no room for denial. The evidence was not a weapon thrown in anger, it was a mirror held up to the system itself. In that reflection, the board could not unsee the rot beneath the polished veneer. They could not pretend that Victor's behavior was an isolated flaw, nor that the structure supporting him was anything less than complicit. The resolution was not immediate, nor was it simple. Justice in the real world rarely comes wrapped in clean endings. There were negotiations, resignations, policy rewrites, and the quiet but unmistakable shifting of power. Some people left rather than adapt. Others stayed and learned, sometimes reluctantly, that dignity was not something to be granted as a favor, but recognized as a right. For Selena, the victory was not in watching Victor lose his position, though that happened. It was in knowing that the culture itself had been forced to change, that the next person who walked into that lobby would not face the same invisible wall she had to climb. She had taken on not just a man, but a system, and she had not been alone in the end. This story is a reminder that allies matter, not just the ones who speak the loudest, but the ones who stand in the quiet corners, ready to act when it counts. It reminds us that systemic bias thrives when good people look away, and it falters when even a few decide that their conscience will not let them be complicit. The lesson here is not only about bravery, it is about persistence. It is about knowing that every time you refuse to let prejudice slide, you are planting something that may grow long after the moment has passed. Selena's journey tells us that justice is not about winning one argument. It is about creating conditions where the argument no longer needs to be fought. The difference between superficial policy and genuine human respect is as wide as the space between compliance and compassion. One can be written into a handbook. The other has to be written into hearts. Her philosophy remains: strength is not always loud, but it must always be steady. If you believe in standing for dignity, if you have ever faced the weight of bias and refused to let it define you, then let this story be a spark. If you like the story, then leave it number 1 in the comments and subscribe to our channel to hear the next story. Justice needs voices. Yours might be the one that changes the ending for someone else.